We have seen autopsies with distended veins, and you can imagine the person inside is going, even as they look very peaceful. In 84% of the time, the prisoner is dying because they are drowning on their own fluids. The average time of lethal injection for the one drug protocol is around 18 minutes. Executioners tried and failed to access the vein for over 2 hours. The Department of Corrections investigated itself.
Okay.
And said, we're great. Arizona spent $1.5 million on drugs for 3 executions, and it botched all 3. Texas was found to be using drugs, I think they were 1,300 days old. These are drugs that expire, depending upon how they are being stored, within 40 days.
Hi everyone, welcome to Death Row Stories. I'm in Clayton, New Mexico, and in that grave lies Thomas Ketchum, also known as Black Jack. He was a cowboy and became a train robber and was executed in this small town in 1901. You can find a picture of him just a bit before he was executed. But the problem is the people in charge of his hanging had no experience. The rope was too long and he was too heavy, 215 pounds. When he fell through the trapdoor, he was decapitated. You can find pictures of people posing in front of his body. They even made postcards out of this event. One of the reasons hangings were phased out was the high number of botched executions, like this one. Today in the US, most of the time, lethal injections are used to kill condemned prisoners. Let's talk about them with Corinna Barrett Lane. She wrote a book about lethal injection. It's titled Secrets of the Killing State: The Untold Story of Lethal Injection.
Check the mic, Death Row Stories drop. Needles and veins, the system's plot. Pentobarbital lies, expired and cold. Snakes play God, but the truth unfolds. Secrets of lethal injections exposed.
I'm Corinna Lane, and I am the George E. Allen Chair in Law at the University of Richmond School of Law and author of the 2025 book, Secrets of the Killing State: The Untold Story of Lethal Injection.
Thank you for writing this very interesting book, and thank you for joining us on Death Row Stories. You explained that 2,300 people are right now on death row and that 98% of the executions are done in the US by lethal injections. Let's start with some history. How did lethal injection become the main method of execution in the US?
So lethal injection was invented in 1977, and the timing was no fortuity. In 1972, the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty. Many Americans don't know that, but we didn't have a death penalty for a short period of time. The Supreme Court brought it back in 1976, and by 1977, this new death penalty was beginning, and the country had not seen an execution in 10 years. There had been one execution by firing squad. That was Gary Gilmore saying, let's do it in Utah. But Americans reacted to that in a very, they were very upset about it. Here we've got the state shooting people and shedding blood. And so there was a great discussion in 1977 about how the American public is going to be squeamish about, abject state violence, and we needed another way. And also at the time, a federal court had found a First Amendment right to televise executions. Now, it wouldn't last, but nobody could have known that. And so state legislatures around the country were thinking about, what is this going to be like if we have an execution on TV? Here in Texas, there were legislators that talked about, well, we can't have an electrocution in someone's living room. We need to find this other way. And so the idea was, well, what about a death by drugs? And various legislators were asking their personal doctors, were asking the state medical boards to help, and no one wanted to participate. And so in Oklahoma, in 1977, the legislators asked the state medical examiner, a man named Dr. J. Chapman. He was the state coroner, and he rather famously referred to himself as an expert in dead bodies, but not in how to get them that way. And they asked him to help, and he said, sure, I will. And with that, the birth of lethal injection as a method of execution occurred. Texas adopted lethal injection immediately after Oklahoma, and Texas conducted the first lethal injection in 1982. And after that, it all began.
First of all, killing someone by lethal injection requires a lot of skills. You need to mix the drugs, for example, because you just can't buy poison. You need to make sure you use the right drugs. You need to place an IV. You need to inject the drugs and so on. Every state has its own requirements, I guess. And what are they?
Well, as you say, they vary from state to state. And I think one of the things that you said is very important. You said, well, we don't just go out and buy poison. Lethal injection, it's a nice, sort of clean, sanitized way of saying it, but we are poisoning people to death. That is what we are doing. And as far as who can do that, well, really, it is entirely up to the states. And the only place that we see any qualifications at all is for the people who inject the catheter into the veins. Other than that, there are absolutely no qualifications.
No qualification at all?
No.
Anyone can do the mixing of the drugs?
In theory, yeah. I mean, it depends on the state, but by and large, the states only set qualifications for those who are actually inserting the catheter. The rest is entirely left up to the warden. And in fact, even then, I document in the book, for example, Arizona, one of the executioners, he later testified that the warden called him. He was a former medical corpsman. He had been served in this role 15 years ago. His only qualification was that the warden called him and said, hey, can you insert a catheter? Would you be willing to do it for an execution? Those were the only questions. He had not inserted a catheter for 15 years. And he became one of the medical members of the medical team. And, you know, even where we have qualifications, what I found and what litigation has shown is that even when the state has a protocol, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Department of Corrections is following it. And so there have been numerous instances, I document those in the book, where there are supposed to be medical qualifications and the person is not medically qualified.
Well, we'll talk about those. You were mentioning those protocols to kill someone. Are they decided by a medical team at the head of each state?
No,
No.
but we don't exactly know who has made them because the entire process is covered by secrecy. And so there are numerous instances where litigants, where investigative journalists have asked, well, no other state in the country uses this protocol. How did you come up with it? And the state's answer is, we're not telling. We're not telling. But we know it's not done by experts because we know that some of the resulting protocols don't make any sense. And so, for example, Tennessee in 2007 had a protocol that essentially cut and pasted the word lethal injection over execution, resulting in a protocol that told executioners to shave the prisoner's head and to have a fire extinguisher handy. Makes absolutely no sense. North Carolina in 2004, actually Oklahoma as well, had a protocol that called for injecting the anesthetic, injecting half of it at the beginning of the execution and half of it after the drug that kills the person was already injected.
Wow.
And, medical experts looked at this and said, it makes absolutely no sense to inject an anesthetic or any drug really in someone who is already dead. And that just the very fact that the protocol was written that way made it quite clear that the people who were writing the protocol had absolutely no idea what they were doing. And one might ask, well, why aren't the medical boards involved? And that goes back to the Hippocratic Oath and the fact that medical scientists, medical doctors, they've taken an oath to use their knowledge to heal and not to hurt. And so it's not quite so simple as to say, well, let's just get an expert involved. There are separate problems with that.
So they're doing all this without any doctor helping them because of this sermon.
We don't know who's helping them. What we can say is that these protocols don't make any sense, and so they're either doing it without advice or with the advice of someone who is not particularly skilled. It's all under the table. And so who knows the qualifications of the person who decides to help, who that even is.
A lot of states use a 3-drug protocol, and one of these drugs is prohibited in 42 states in animal euthanasia. I need to understand.
Well, so the second drug, the drug that you're referring to, is pancuronium bromide. And that drug is a paralytic. And two things are important to know about it. The first is it's not only a paralytic, it's also a muscle relaxant. So the way it works is that it relaxes the muscles in the face and then it freezes them that way. And so you're going to get a very nice drifting off to sleep look, regardless of what is actually happening. And that is one reason why it is explicitly not allowed in animal euthanasia. Because in animal euthanasia, we actually care about a humane death. And so something that would hide suffering makes no sense in that context. But the other thing to know about pancuronium bromide is that it works from the outside in. And so the first thing that happens is it puts a chemical veil, chemically entombs someone. And then the last thing that it paralyzes is the muscles in the body's core. And that includes the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is the muscle that pushes air into the lungs. And so the other thing to know about pancuronium bromide is that as it paralyzes the diaphragm, the person's ability to breathe is less and less. And so we have seen autopsies with distended veins, and you can imagine the person inside is going, even as they look very peaceful, they are struggling to breathe as the diaphragm is slowly being paralyzed. And medical professionals have referred to this as being the sensation of being buried alive. And so the thing about pancuronium bromide is it's a double whammy. It both conceals pain and it causes pain. The fact that so many states use pancuronium bromide is a tell. If one really cared about a humane execution, there would be no reason to use pancuronium bromide. And in fact, that is one of the things that prisoners have argued in lethal injection litigation. That second drug is entirely superfluous. It has no real function. The first drug in the protocol is an anesthetic. It's supposed to make it so it's not painful. The third drug causes a cardiac arrest. It's supposed to kill within 2 minutes. And so what does the second drug do? It's purely cosmetic. And states have pretty much admitted as much. They haven't used those words. They've said, well, the purpose of the paralytic is to give a dignified death. Dignified because we can't see suffering, which is to say it's fully cosmetic.
Oh, they want people to look like they're falling asleep, right?
Right. Because that's the narrative. And I must say it's a narrative that Americans have bought and that I also believed in before I started this project.
So today we still use the 3-drug protocol that Chapman created?
Well, sort of. Some states use the 3-drug protocol. Some states have moved to a 1-drug protocol. But even the states that have stuck with the 3-drug protocol have had to change the first drug because the initial drug, sodium thiopental, is no longer available. It's been replaced. It was obsolete back in 1977, even more so now. They've substituted for other drugs that have added problems of their own and have added even more complications.
But even the 3-drug protocol created, the original one by Chapman, we found out years later that it didn't work that well, right?
That's correct. Early studies, showed that it didn't work the way that Chapman thought it would work. Experts for the state said, well, the person will suffer a cardiac arrest within 2 minutes. 99.999% certain this will happen. And there were no studies. None. Nothing to back that up. It's just out of thin air. But the fact that states started executing with this protocol inadvertently created data because each execution, well, now we have records of what happened in that execution. And so the very fact of executions created the data. The data drew scientists. And when scientists looked at the data, they found these people actually did not have a cardiac arrest within 2 minutes. So the main study was in California. California had 11 executions by lethal injection. And in 6 of those, so more than half, the prisoner did not die within 2 minutes or anywhere close. It was more like 9 minutes after the injection of the third drug, the potassium chloride.
And why was that?
Why weren't they dying right away? Well, what the scientists actually found is that the first drug, the barbiturate, at the time, that was sodium thiopental, was slowing the circulation, which then dulled the effect of the third drug, which was supposed to race to the heart and cause a cardiac arrest. And so no one really accounted for the fact that a massive overdose of the first drug would actually blunt the effect of the third drug. And so what they ended up concluding was, the prisoner's hearts raced, but not enough to trigger the cardiac arrest. And so instead, the prisoners were dying the slow death of suffocation by the second drug, the paralytic.
What did Chapman say when he was confronted with the fact that his 3-drug protocol didn't work that well?
He was nonchalant. He said, "Give me a break." He said, "The things I've seen that these people did, why should I worry about how these horses patoots," that's what he called them. "Why should we worry about how these horses patoots died? Give me a break."
Years later, we found out that there were problems with all the protocols, right?
Indeed. So the early studies were of the traditional 3-drug protocol that states used for the first 30 years of lethal injection, and those found didn't work as they said. In 2020, scientists came back. By that time, some states had moved to a 1-drug protocol. Even states using the 3-drug protocol were using different drugs. And so in this 2020 study, they looked at all the protocols. And what they found is that across the board, in 84% of the autopsies, those autopsies showed that the prisoners suffered from acute pulmonary edema as they died. Now, pulmonary edema is when fluid seeps into the lungs. And my understanding is it's not incredibly uncommon. That's pneumonia and other things could cause pulmonary edema. Acute pulmonary edema is when the fluid seeps into the lungs in seconds and minutes, rather than days and weeks and months, as with pulmonary edema. And the sensation of fluid rapidly entering into the lungs has been described by medical professionals as the sensation of waterboarding. So what we're finding is that across the board, whatever protocol they're using, in 84% of the time, the prisoner is dying because they are drowning on their own fluids. So essentially, we're waterboarding people to death.
So you mean that states are doing it all wrong?
Yes. And the perverse thing is that they come out and say, this is how this is going to work. And they say it with confidence. 99% of the time, or within a degree of scientific certainty. They say it with such confidence as though they know what they're doing. But then when you look behind it, or when you see the actual science, you realize none of that's true. They're just saying it with confidence.
So recently, a few states decided to halt executions to make sure they had a clear protocol. Can you tell us about this?
Yes. Generally, when that has happened, in fact, every time that has happened, it has happened after a highly publicized botched execution. So something went very, very wrong. The state is under extreme pressure, and a state official comes out and says, well, we're going to do an independent investigation. We're going to find out what was wrong. Most states do not actually do an independent investigation. So Oklahoma said it was going to do an independent investigation, and the governor appointed a member of her own cabinet to lead it.
Really?
Yes. And not only was this a member of her own cabinet, but the person had come up from the Department of Corrections that he was supposed to be investigating.
Wow.
And so he was an insider. And not only that, but he had been present. He was a material witness at the execution that was horribly botched that led to the call for an independent investigation. So, you know, no,
Was part of the problem.
yeah, he was there, he was a witness, and no part of being a material witness says independent investigation. But, you know, that was Oklahoma. Alabama had a horribly botched execution. This was the 3-hour long execution. Yes,
Hour.
3 hours. And that was in 2022. And they said, we're going to do an investigation. And the Department of Corrections investigated itself
Okay.
and said, we're great. Arizona actually hired an independent investigator, a retired federal judge, and he started finding things, and they fired him.
Oh, really?
And then once again, the Department of Corrections did an investigation of itself and said, we're great, give us our warrant. You know, then we have Tennessee. So Tennessee is perhaps the exception to the rule that we've seen in other states. Tennessee actually hired an outside firm to do the investigation. They issued a scathing report. And the governor of Tennessee said, we're going to have new leadership. This is a problem from the top. Going to oust the old leader. We're going to hire new leadership and everything's going to be grand. And they hired the guy from Arizona who had been part of the problem in Arizona.
Oh, really?
When you look at the pattern of what the states are doing, those independent investigations only occur after an embarrassing public moment when the state is under pressure to do something. And they're rarely actually independent. And it's really hard to say that the states in those instances are looking to make real change as opposed to get past the embarrassing moment so they can get back to executions. In Oklahoma, for example, after that long and 6-year laborious process, Oklahoma began executing again in 2021, and the very first person vomited on the gurney.
Wow. Let's talk about the 2-drug protocol. There's also a 2-drug protocol. Is it better?
No. And actually, the 2-drug protocol was a very short-lived protocol, pardon the pun. A couple states, 2 states used it. This was midazolam, which is a sedative, with hydromorphone, which is a powerful opioid. And here again, the state's experts said, well, the person will stop breathing, they'll just drift off to sleep. That's not what happened. The very first use of the 2-drug protocol was Ohio. This was Dennis McGuire in 2014. And he choked and convulsed on the gurney for over 20 minutes. It was Ohio's longest execution in the state's history. And one might think that given this terrible way that it worked out, that no state would go near it again. But no, Arizona within several months, decided that it would use the exact same protocol to execute Joseph Wood. It did that in 2014, and that resulted in a nearly 2-hour-long execution as Joseph Wood gasped over and over and over on the gurney. So 2 times the 2-drug protocol was used, both times absolutely disastrous. Since that time, no state has tried the 2-drug protocol.
This 2-drug protocol isn't used anymore, but midazolam is still used, right?
Absolutely. A number of states are still using midazolam, and these states use it with a paralytic. So I think of Oklahoma is a very good example of that. And those executions are marked by visible suffering. Prison guards, witnesses, they see the prisoners clenching their fists, biting, clenching their jaw, blinking. None of that should be happening if you're actually under anesthesia. They see them gasping for breath, choking. And yet, they're still using it. And the reason that states are still able to use midazolam, I lay at the feet of our current Supreme Court. In 2015, the Supreme Court of the United States decided a case, Glossop versus Gross, in which the court green-lighted states to be able to use midazolam. There, the court said the burden of proof is on the prisoner trying to challenge the protocol. So it's not the state's burden to show a safe or torture-free protocol. The state doesn't have to prove a thing. It's all on the prisoner to show that the protocol is torturous, not on the state to show that it isn't. And although the prisoners put forth lots of science, the Supreme Court said, yes, but all of the science you have cited is in the medical setting where they use normal doses. And so there is no science on midazolam in the amounts that executioners are injecting, such as here, 500 milligrams. So essentially, the Supreme Court said, well, there's no science. We just don't know. So states, you're good to go.
Wow. And the Supreme Court also said that prisoners who are afraid to suffer deeply during an execution have to provide an alternative way to be killed.
That's true. So a prisoner challenging a lethal injection protocol, making an execution challenge, saying this is cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment, that prisoner not only has to prove that the execution method is torturous, but also has to provide the state with an alternative way to kill them. And the perverse results of this were apparent in an oral argument in the next lethal injection case, because what that means is that even if a prisoner proved a torturous execution, if they didn't also provide the alternative, the Supreme Court would say you lose. Well, in 2019, this came up, and if you don't mind, I'd love to share with you the little passage of oral arguments. So this is oral arguments before the Supreme Court in a case, a 2019 case called Bucklew versus Precythe. Quote, so are you saying that even if the method imposes gruesome, brutal pain, you can still go forward? Justice Kavanaugh asked the state's lawyer. The state's lawyer hemmed and hawed. Justice Kavanaugh, so you're saying even if the method imposes gruesome, brutal pain? Again, the lawyer squirmed. Is that a yes? Justice Kavanaugh persisted. Quote, yes, it is, Your Honor. The lawyer finally conceded, and that is the holding of Glossop. After Glossop, showing a torturous death doesn't prove a constitutional claim.
Wow.
You have to also perversely provide the state with an alternative way to kill you. And imagine the attorneys whose job, whose ethical duty is to represent their client and to try to save their life, as part of making the claim, have to actually tell the state, and if that doesn't work, here's an alternative way to kill my client.
The states have another issue. Europe doesn't want to sell them a certain number of drugs, and big pharmaceutical companies don't want either, but they still find ways to get these drugs, and some of these ways were found illegal. Can you give us a few examples of that?
There are so many examples of this. But yes, it comes down to this fundamental problem. And you've named both of them. One is a chief supplier, is Big Pharma in Europe. And Europe, as you know, has long been abolitionist on the death penalty. And so Europe actually adopted export controls on its drugs. Exporters have to show that there's no reasonable likelihood that their exports to the United States will get into executioners' hands. So they have adopted intricate ways of tracking their drugs. They force buyers to sign contractual agreements. So all of that has pretty much ended, cut off the supply of drugs from Europe. And then, as you say, you've got the pharmaceutical producers themselves. And it's hard to blame them. They didn't make these drugs to kill people. And you can just look at their corporate mottos, their sales mottos. I think of Pfizer, life is our life's work. Or, wellness is our business, or helping people live longer, better lives. All of those are fundamentally inconsistent with injecting drugs that cause people to promptly die. And so with both of those avenues, states have had very limited choices. They have two choices. One is to find some sort of international supplier that is not Europe. And they've done that in India, for example, with Harris Pharma. So Harris Pharma was just a guy named Chris Harris. The FDA and the DEA seized drugs coming across the border from Harris Pharma. Harris Pharma was not an FDA-approved supplier. Harris Pharma had absolutely no labels on the drugs, which violates every import provision there is. Some investigative journalists actually went over to India and said, well, who is this Harris Pharma that's selling drugs to Texas and Arizona, Nebraska? And they found, when they went to the office space that was listed on the FDA approval or the FDA paperwork, it was just an office in a 60-story building that said Harris Pharma Manufacturing and Distributing. And this little office building had no manufacturing, and Chris Harris has no pharmaceutical experience or expertise and has no employees. So, that was just a front. And then they went to the investigative journalists, interestingly, went to the address that was listed on his DEA paperwork, and they found it was just a residential flat. and that Chris Harris had skipped town without paying 6 or 7 months' rent. His landlord said, I can't reach him anymore. The phone's disconnected. And all I recall is him saying there's some big deal in the United States. And if he makes this deal, he'll be set for life. So, that's Harris Pharma. Behold, Harris Pharma, a con man who's actually using other people's drugs, and states are trying to smuggle it across the border. So it's no exaggeration to say that these executing states were literally smuggling drugs across the border. And when the FDA seized those drugs, Texas actually sued the FDA for its unjustified seizure. That resulted in litigation, and eventually the drugs expired and the litigation just fizzled out.
And some states also try to buy those drugs here in the US, but they try to hide this to the drug companies, right? Tell us about Ohio, for example.
Ohio has not executed in quite some time. And the reason is that Ohio's governor, DeWine, has a moratorium on executions. And the reason for that is that the Ohio Department of Corrections was caught making a straw purchase of execution drugs. And so there was an email from the Department of Corrections official to official at the Department of Health and Addiction, Mental Health Services, saying, when you make the purchase, don't tell them it's for us. Don't tell them it's for executions. And again, the reason for that is that these drug companies have contractual provisions on their sales, and they're tracking all of this. They really mean it when they say, we don't want our drugs used for this particular purpose.
So this is illegal to try to hide it, right?
Well, now we have states that are making straw purchases and are intentionally violating private contracts. They're intentionally breaching these contracts with these companies. And then what has happened from that is the companies have actually sued the Department of Corrections. And so we've got litigation, all of which is paid for by the taxpayers, of course.
No.
But it's quite something to have the state intentionally breaching private contracts and getting sued. I mean, that's the sort of bad actor that we would expect to see in some fraudster. And yet, it's the State Department of Corrections that's doing it.
For several states like Texas, like South Dakota, the solution was compounding pharmacies. Can you tell us what they are and what are the issues with these pharmacies?
A compounding pharmacy is, generally they're small mom and pop shops, but what they do is they actually create drugs for custom order. And so oftentimes you would go to a compounding pharmacy if you couldn't swallow a drug, and they would give it to you in liquid form, or perhaps you're allergic to some ingredient. It's a very personalized creation of a drug that is otherwise manufactured. The thing about compounding pharmacies is that, unlike manufacturers that are creating big batches of drugs, compounding pharmacies, they are pharmacies. They make drugs and sell drugs upon a prescription. And you can't get a prescription for lethal injection drugs. And so this has created several problems, one of which is the types of compounding pharmacies that are willing to exchange drugs under the table for a bag of cash. Those pharmacies tend to be pharmacies that have a number of other regulatory problems. There's one pharmacy that Missouri was using that had over 1,800 regulatory violations. Texas has gone through several of these compounding pharmacies. So one of the earliest ones that we learned about was Green Park Pharmacy, and it was on probation status, and it had over 48 regulatory violations, citations. More recently, we know that Texas used a compounding pharmacy called Rite Aid, and that was particularly sketchy. The pharmacy employees talked about someone from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice showing up in an unmarked car with a bag of what we call API. It's active pharmaceutical ingredient. It's the ingredient that you need when you're going to compound a drug. And so these people were showing up, again, completely outside the chain of having any sort of prescription, but they're showing up in an unmarked car with a bag of API. In one particular case, the employee said, yeah, and there was a photocopied FDA label. I think that is itself a violation of federal law. You can't just copy these labels, but they did. And it turns out that, the supplier of this API was a chemical company that doesn't even make drugs for human consumption. They make chemicals for calibrating machines. So, this is the sort of thing that we're seeing when it's all under the table. The other problem with compounding pharmacies is that even if you didn't have super sketchy compounding pharmacies doing the work, compounding pharmacies are actually not generally set up to compound sterile injectables. And in fact, within the industry, compounding a sterile injectable is literally called high-risk compounding, for the very fact that this isn't really what compounding pharmacies are set up to do. These are generally little mom and pop shops. They don't have the sterile rooms and all of the things that you would need to do this very, very delicate, high-risk compounding. So the even outside the high-risk compounding setting, the error rate in compounded drugs is around 25%, compared to the error rate in manufactured drugs, which is under 2%, just to give you some idea of the scale. And then again, when you add in who these compounding pharmacies are, you begin to get a sense of just how problematic this is.
And those states are ready to pay a lot to have these drugs, right?
Oh, the amount that they're willing to pay for drugs to do an under-the-table drug transaction is incredible. So, for example, Arizona spent $1.5 million on drugs for 3 executions, and it botched all 3 in 2022. And those drugs expired before they could use more. I also think in this context about Idaho. In Idaho, Department of Corrections officials took a suitcase full of $15,000 in cash, chartered a private plane to fly over to Washington to do an under-the-table drug deal for cash. And these are the sorts of things where you think people would go to prison for this, as in you and I would go to prison for this. And yet, it's our government that is doing these shady drug deals and spending millions of taxpayer money. And it's not just the government, it's the Department of Corrections. It's so perverse.
Because this is, to be clear, this is illegal to do that.
Yes. Yes. These are all Schedule 1 and 2 drugs. You need a prescription under state and federal law.
Can you say a word about Texas, which is using today used drugs, right, to execute its prisoners?
Yes. So Texas uses a compounding pharmacy. And there was litigation in the last several years because in 2019, Texas was found to be using drugs. I think they were 1,300 days old. In 2021, the date of those drugs, it was 630 days old. These are drugs that expire, depending upon how they are being stored, within 40 days, 45 days. And so this is way over any plausible limit. And, even just finding out how old these drugs were, Texas was not sharing the expiration dates. And so it actually took some sleuthing on the behalf of Capitol defenders, watching shipments coming in and marking that date and then saying, oh, wait a minute, these drugs, this is from this shipment. These drugs are at least 1,000 days old. So that was its own thing. And then once they figured out, oh, these drugs are long expired, Texas's response was, well, we just extended the dates. And I think one of the interesting things there is that there was a pharmacy professor, and she came in and testified and was just, you could tell, visibly upset. And she said, you can't just change the dates. Like, you can't just do that. But that's what Texas did. And so the prisoner sued, and the trial court found that the state had violated numerous state laws. But the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals found that the trial court had no legal ability to stop their executions on that basis. And so the state of Texas just executed the plaintiffs one by one. Boop. So much for that lawsuit.
In 2012, Missouri announced it would be using propofol for its next executions. The medical community was outraged, imploring them not to. Can you tell us why?
Sure. By that time, propofol was the leading anesthetic and used over 50 million times in surgery and other procedures every single year. And so what the medical community said is that if you use this drug, the European Union has already said, you can't export. We're not going to export anything unless we have reasonable assurance that it will stay out of executioners' hands. So if you use it, the EU will cut off exports. And this is going to send back the field of anesthesiology by a good 20 years. So they came out and said this, and it's quite something that the state would be willing to use a drug for one execution that would send an entire field back for the entire population of this country. But what happened is the governor blinked and he said, fine, we won't use it. And no state has gone near propofol since.
In 2017, Arizona found a creative solution to the drug shortage. Can you tell us about this?
The state had a new solution, and it was BYOD, bring your own drug. So the state actually said, if you don't want to use our drugs, just provide us the drugs and we will kill you with your own drugs. Of course, the lawyers for the prisoners said, the prisoners are not going to be able to get their own drug. And the lawyers said, I can't just go out and get drugs for my clients, not for any reason, but especially not to kill my clients. Of course, they can't get a prescription either, but the thought of it is pretty insane, I think. And needless to say, no prisoner has taken the state up on its offer.
So this idea was abandoned, or?
As far as I know, it's still there, but it's ridiculous, and so no one has used it. But it's a testament to just how desperate states are to get the drugs. Fine, we're not getting good drugs. We're getting compounded drugs, and they're error prone, and we're not using the right drugs. So look, if you can get some drugs, we'll take your drugs.
Wow.
That's quite something.
Alabama found another solution. Since January 2024, they use nitrogen gas. Is this a better solution according to you?
No. This too is experimental. The state of Alabama promised in pleadings before the court, the person will take a couple breaths, they'll be out in seconds, they'll be dead. And none of that happened. The very first person who was executed was Kenny Smith. And Kenny Smith actually, the state of Alabama had tried to execute Kenny Smith earlier by lethal injection, and it was so badly botched that Kenny Smith survived his own execution.
Wow.
And so then Alabama said, well, we'll just kill you in a different way. And that execution was 22 minutes long.
Wow.
And he choked and gasped and spit up inside the mask. His spiritual advisor was in the chamber with him and said, that he could see his veins going every which way, thought his eyes would pop out. Just an absolute horrific, torturous sight. And there were veteran reporters there, media, that had seen many executions before, and they all had the same impression. They said it was so violent that the gurney itself shook.
And how have they been able to buy this nitrogen gas?
Well, it's hard to say because of secrecy laws exactly where they're getting it. But I think the point you're getting at is, that what about suppliers of nitrogen gas? And in fact, the suppliers of gas have also started putting contractual provisions on the sales of their product. And I mean, you can understand why. You've got these suppliers of gas that are for fire extinguishers and children's balloons. They don't want their gas. They don't want their product being used to kill people any more than drug manufacturers want their products being used to kill people.
So you think it will be an issue in the future for Alabama to get this gas?
It's hard to say.
And even the people selling those masks, I guess they could also ask for them not to be sold for executions?
Yeah, they could. My understanding is, the mask is it's not a normal mask. And I think if they had one, they could use it repeatedly. So it's not clear. I think the supply issue will be more in the gas.
Alabama has the longest execution ever, right?
Yes, nearly 3 hours. That's the 2022 botched execution of Joe Nathan James. And one of the difficulties is that we don't actually know what happened because much of that time was spent behind a closed curtain. And when they finally did open the curtain, James was already out cold, but his autopsy shows a brutal death and gross mishandling, gross incompetence.
Can you tell us about Rommel Broom?
Rommel Broom was the first person in 60 years to survive his own execution. Executioners tried and failed to access the vein for over 2 hours. He was stuck more than 18 times. And, it was so bad and so traumatic. Broom started crying. One of the executioners left the room hurriedly, and someone said, "Are you okay?" And she said no as she left. But, and it was also perverse in a sense that Rommel Broom was trying to help. He was trying to show he was a former IV drug user, trying to say, okay, well, try here or try there. And at the end, the executioners were circling back to attempted sites that they had already used. So they're putting a needle into bloody and bruised sites. It should just be incredibly painful.
Wow. There's a pattern of media being kept away from the reality of lethal injections, right?
Yeah, and the state does this in a number of ways, lowering the blinds when something starts to go wrong. So we just don't even know what was actually happening there. And then they don't tell. Turning off the sound so that we can't hear what's going on. Officials flatly denying that something happened when it's clear that something happened. Secrecy statutes. So I always think of Arkansas in this context. Arkansas's secrecy statute not only said, we're not going to give you this information, but it went on to say, and if you are to find it yourself, and if you share it in any way, we will make you a felon. You'll be a felon. And that's clearly aimed at the media. And there are also cases where particular media witnesses were denied access after writing something, critical of the Department of Corrections. So there's any number of ways that the state departments of corrections keep the reporters from being able to do their job.
As a conclusion, would you say that lethal injection is worse than the electric chair? Because in Tennessee, prisoners can choose their method of execution, and most of them choose the electric chair.
Between 2018 and 2024, 5 of the 7 prisoners that were executed in Tennessee chose to be electrocuted to death. And electrocution is a ghastly affair. People talk about the smell of burning flesh. It's just absolutely disgusting. And electrocution is also the only execution method that states themselves have said violates the Constitution. So Nebraska has said it's unconstitutional under its state constitution, the same as Georgia. And so these are terrible, terrible deaths. And when prisoners were asked, why are you choosing to die by the electric chair as opposed to lethal injection? Their answer was consistent. They said, well, we know what's actually happening with lethal injection. We know we will suffer a torturous death either way. Our best move is to make it quick. So death by electrocution is 2 to 3 minutes, maybe 5. The average time of lethal injection for the one drug protocol is around 18 minutes. That's a long time to suffer. So I can't say one way is better than the other. It's just a question of how long they take and what is the deception that goes with it.
So lethal injection is causing a lot of suffering. It costs a lot of money. It makes those states violate the laws. So why do they stick to it?
That's a great question. And it's one that I myself was asking as I was getting into it. You know, they can't get the drugs. They can't get the medical professionals that they need. They can't get access to the veins. These people have notoriously weak veins. As you say, cost a lot of money. They're violating, state and federal laws. Why? Why are they sticking with lethal injection? And what I've come to conclude is that lethal injection just does one thing well, just one, and that is it hides the violence of state killing. I was thinking of what I had read one place. It's not in the book, but where a doctor said the heart stops reluctantly. And what he was explaining is that before the body is ready to give up life on its own, it takes physical force to stop the heart from beating. It could be a car accident, it could be a homicide, it could be an execution, but it takes physical force, it takes violence to end life before the body is ready to end it on its own. And what's special about lethal injection is that it internalizes that violence. It hides that violence. And I've come to think that this is doing incredible work in maintaining our death penalty today. Nothing to see here. Move along, right? We don't have to think about it. With the firing squad, with lethal injection, we don't have to see the sight of blood. With the firing squad, we don't have to smell burning flesh, like with the electric chair. We don't have to see people gasping, choking. We get to tell ourselves that people are just falling into forever sleep. And that makes it easier not to think about what state killing actually is. I think that's the work that lethal injection is doing.
On YouTube, I'm probably going to have a lot of comments saying, why should we care? These people have done horrible crimes.
Half of the equation is, does this person deserve to die? The other half of the equation is, did the state do what it needs to do to deserve to take that life? Just because they did something, you can't just pick them up and do whatever you want. You have to follow the law. And my work is more about that second question. I think it would be hard to read this book and answer anything other than the state cannot be trusted to take life and has not done what it needs to do to make a claim to take that life. But more fundamentally, when I think about torturous deaths, because many of these murders, right, they could be terribly torturous murders. And I think, well, why don't we rape rapists? Why don't we burn down arsonists' homes? Why don't we torture torturers? Why don't we burn them alive? And, it's not that they don't deserve that in some talionic eye for an eye way. The answer is that we could never get even. That would allow us to get even with a condemned capital murderer. But society can't stoop that low, right? We can't take this conduct that we're saying is absolutely unacceptable and say, so that's going to be our standard. We're society, so we can't use the conduct of the worst criminals as the standard for what's okay for society.
Well, thank you very much for joining us for Death Row Stories. I really appreciated this conversation.
It was wonderful. Thank you for having me on.
Before the end of this episode, I wanted to let you know that Charles Thompson, who I interviewed a few months ago, it was episode 16, was executed by lethal injection. It was January 28, 2026. 10 months ago, I wrote a short episode. It was episode 12 about Demon Bloodson, who was then on death row. On March 17, 2026, a judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. I hope you found my interview with Corina Lane interesting. Every view helps the show grow, so please tell your friends about it. It really helps a lot. And if you're listening to the podcast version on Spotify, please rate the show. I need more ratings. It also helps a lot other people find the show. It's my only reward, so go ahead. Thank you.